Greetings and welcome back to part 3 of our lecture on ancient China. Today's lesson goes along with worksheet 6, which you should have picked up, titled the same, Ancient China, Han Empires in China. Today we'll talk about the longest lasting dynasty in China, the Han Dynasty obviously, and even talk a little bit about empresses that ruled in China as well. So let us get started. Here's obviously a map of China. This is what the Han Dynasty looked like after the dynasty had fallen, later on in early 200s AD. By the end of their rule, they actually expanded, more than doubled, obviously, their size to the point of where it almost looks like modern China today. Modern China today actually goes a little bit further west, more along over here, and stretches, this part here actually is part of Mongolia up here. Mongolia is right in here. But they did certainly expand their territories into what modern day China is, and we can thank that to the Hans. So, getting started with our worksheet 6, setting the stage. Shi Huangdi and the Qin Dynasty had unified China. If you recall from our last unit, when the Qin Dynasty took over, there were several different smaller sects or parts of China, and it was the Qin Dynasty that basically forced them into one kingdom or one empire through war. Shortly after his death, though, the China again fell apart. The son of Shi Huangdi was a poor leader. He lasted only 2 years, and it ended up, as I mentioned, China falling apart back to the local warlords. But thankfully, or not thankfully I guess, the Han Dynasty restored unity to China. After several years of anguish from the Qin, rival kings wanted to get control back of their territory that had once been taken by Shi Huangdi. After defeating Zhang Yu, Liu Bang declared himself the first emperor of the Han Dynasty. These old kings took control, and they were fighting amongst themselves, wanting more power, just as all kings do. But it wasn't until till Liu Bang was able to defeat or make agreements with these other regions to retake China as it had once been. The Han Dynasty had been separated into two periods throughout its entire history. So remember that. The Han Dynasty was split up into two parts, which we'll talk about each later on. The first being longer than the second. They were separated obviously because of a brief time period when the Huns were out of power. So keep that in the back of your head, because we will be touching upon that near the end of the lecture. Liu Bang was able to get rid of rival kings through war, just like any others. But he also created allies. When he did get control, he created a central government with hundreds of local provincials, or provincials as they call them, called commanderies. Think of this as smaller states, kind of like what we have in the United States. Broke it down, however, his rule was the ultimate rule. And just like the Qin Dynasty, he set off his own personal people to oversee these provincials. To get the people happy and to like him, he lowered taxes and softened harsh punishments. People were kind of upset about the Qin Dynasty and the previous dynasties and how harsh they were, and the high taxes, people not being able to survive and still pay taxes. So to get everybody to like him, he did those things. Liu Bang died in 195 BC, and his son took over, but only in title only. Now listen here, because you're going to kind of get some similarities here with something that happened in Egypt. His mother, Empress Liu, had the real power because her friends suggested to her that she seize power. Empress Liu lived longer than her son, but then continued to name other infants to be empire. Well, because of that, and these infants not being of age to be empires, she was able to still hold on to the power because these infants were too young to rule. But, as with everybody, eventually she died in 180 BC, and Liu Bang's family regained control. To prevent Empress Liu's family from regaining power, Liu Bang's family killed off all of her relatives. Killed off sisters, children, uncles, aunts, whatever, cousins, to make sure that she can't come back. Kind of sounds a little familiar with the power struggle we saw with Hatshepsut in Egypt, with a woman taking over in a man's world. Liu Bang's great-grandson took the throne in 141 BC. He was known as the Martial Emperor because he adopted the policy of extending the empire through war, which seems to be a common theme among many of these male emperors. You want more land? Let's beat everybody in to get it. Wu Di, which was his name, created allies and pushed his northern enemies out of the region. To the north, if you recall, they had the nomads. These nomads kept invading China in order to use the Chinese pasture lands for their own flock. Well, obviously, China and the Chinese people didn't like that too much. So Wu Di ended up taking his huge army, pushing them farther and farther out, not only getting rid of these nomads, but also expanding his northern empire as well. Once he was able to better secure the north, he then turned his army to the south, taking over parts of Vietnam, as well as further east and northeast as well, in the areas of what we call present-day Manchuria and North and South Korea. So he certainly expanded. Now, a little sidebar here. If you look at why is it in the dynasties, it does not necessarily go from father to son. It typically does. But when we're talking about dynasties, it also can stay within the family. So a lot of times, you'd actually have leadership go from father to son, or from uncle to nephew, whatever the case may be, depending on who the children were, and which was the male. And it didn't necessarily have to be the oldest male son either. It was usually up to the emperor to choose his first wife out of several or many that he had, and that first wife and the emperor would choose who the new emperor would be. Obviously, if the emperor had a harem of several wives and all these children, the empresses were always at ends with each other, trying to get the attention of the emperor. They want to be the first wife. They want the special privileges. They want their child to be the emperor. So a lot of times there was this infighting between all the women who were the wives of the emperor to get their child to be the future ruler. The Han emperors, especially under Wu, were highly structured societies. The emperors tried to control the people that they conquered. Obviously, if you conquer a group of land or a group of people, you need to keep them under control. And the way to do that is to get them to assimilate, which we'll talk about in a minute. The Chinese people believed the emperor had divine authority, so they accepted his power because of that. If he is a direct communication to the gods and to the spirits, you're pretty much going to listen to the guy who's got that power. And the emperor is the only one that had that power. Now, to keep any empire working, or any country for that matter, taxes had to be levied among peasants, farmers, and merchants. The government needs money to expand, pay the soldiers to build roads, just like any government does. So there were taxes that were incurred. Additionally, peasants also had to give 1 month of labor on military services each year. Now, that was considered part of their taxes as well. However, if they needed to go more than a month because of a war, they could do that. They could order that. But typically, they were required only 1 month a year, except for extenuating circumstances. Emperor Weidu looked for and provided education for scholars of Confucianism. He wanted to hire the best and the smartest people he could for his job positions, for his bureaucracy. So he set up these schools, and he would send students. These would be schools that would have to be paid for, but students could go, learn about Confucianism, learn about what they needed to learn, and then later on they would take a test. And that test will determine whether or not they could get a government job. Unfortunately, because the schools did charge money, usually the only people that got into school or got the positions were those that could afford school. It was occasionally happened where you would get peasants or people of a lower class to get enough money to go to school, but usually that didn't happen. This system lasted actually until 1912 AD. This idea of people getting the job that they deserve because they're the smartest. So it wasn't even that long ago that this system was put out of place. Basically, during the beginning of World War I, when the Chinese Empire was overthrown. All right. Population swelled under the Han Dynasty's ruling. All that means is it got large. As you expand, open up your lands, well, more people were probably living there, putting them under the umbrella of the Chinese Empire. Because of this large population growth, agriculture was a key to success and for the survival of the people. It even got to the point where the government took over control of salt, mining, ironworks, minting coins, and brewing alcohol. After a while, they did end up even creating their own silk trades and their own silk industry to compete with foreign traders. The thing to remember here also is, in order to promote people to get into agriculture, the government had to give the people something. So the government would say, if you have a very large farm, you could get out of paying taxes if you had a certain size of farm. However, that became troublesome as the years went on. What would happen is, as families or dads die off, it was a tradition for the family to break apart the land into even parts for each of the male heirs. Well, you do that enough time, the farms become smaller and smaller. And the tax break for the peasants, or for the farmers, was only for large farms. As the farms got smaller and smaller, the people would start having to pay taxes. And the peasants, not having enough money to pay taxes, would end up having a problem because they couldn't afford it, creating a social discord between the peasants and the emperor. All right, the Han Unifies Chinese Culture. The Chinese government encouraged assimilation, getting people to adapt to their culture. This is done partly by recording history for people to read. Bao Zai, who was a writer, actually wrote lessons for women, telling women to be humble and obedient. That's kind of similar to what we do in a lot of countries. Whereas, in order to get people to understand our cultures, to respect our cultures and our history, you teach it to them. You teach it to them in a way so that it becomes part of their life as well, thereby making them part of your society, even though they might have been born somewhere else. To give you an example, even in America today, to pass the immigration test, to become an American citizen, you must take U.S. history courses as one of the requirements. So even today, some of these things are going on to get people to assimilate and become accustomed to the culture that they're moving into. Back to the women. Women lived quiet lives at home. They dedicated their lives to their families, per Confucian teachings. Women with rich husbands, though, tended to be more educated and sometimes ran small shops or practiced medicine. While the husband's out working, getting money, the wife also was able to tend the counter for other types of funds. Women typically, if they were richer, were a little bit more educated than the men were. But it's also something to remember that it was also the women originally that did most of the education for the kids, if those kids could not afford to go to these schools that I mentioned earlier. The fall of the Han and their eventual return. After a while, there became a large imbalance between the rich and the poor, caused by the customs of the Han Empire. Land, as I mentioned before, was divided up among descendants equally upon owner's death. As time went by, the families owned less land. Large farms had no taxes. Small farms did. The government pressed small farms for more taxes, but they couldn't provide it. This created discord and problems between the rich and the poor. Eventually, a guy by the name of Wang Mang took control of the empire after several weaker leaders from the Han Dynasty. His economic policies and redistribution of land angered powerful landowners and hurt the economy. This led to the assassination of Wang in 23 AD, and the Han family took over again. Wang Mang believed that in order for the country to heal itself, you needed to make the rich and the poor more equal. One of those methods was to take all the land, divide it up equally among everybody. However, the rich people, they were still rich then, just did not like that. They had all this money, they had all this land, and now they're told they don't have it anymore. We got to give it up. So after a while, the rich kind of had a problem with that. In addition to the fact that Wang Mang minted more coins. Well, with any type of economic system, if you make more money, they're going to charge you more cost to purchase things. If there's more money available, they're going to raise their cost. And that's exactly what happened. So initially it was good, all this money was flowing around, and then the businesses said, well, hey, let's jack up our prices. And that's what they did. So in the end, in regards to economics, it didn't help anything. And Wang Mang was basically a failure. After peace was restored, with the Hans back in power, this would be the second part of the Han's empire. The beginning of the second part, it started prosperous. People were happy. However, this empire went back to their old ways, divvying up the land based on the rich, all of their traditional customs in place, thereby splitting up the poor and the rich once again. During this time, though, the government continued to expand, but eventually the same social imbalances and political problems and social unrest led to the fall of the Han Empire by 220 AD. All right. That is the end of our part 3 of our notes. Again, this goes with worksheet 6, which you should have picked up during class. Feel free to view this video again if you need to clarify any materials or fill in any of your blanks from your notes. If you have any questions, please let Mr. Vincent know, and have a good day.